My throat want to tighten up for some reason. Yeah. All right. We are continuing through our Sermon on the Mount and arriving this morning at Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42 to begin with. And as Jesus goes into this section of his talk with them, he deals with issues that probably still, to some degree, ring very true with us. And I sort of classify a lot of them as some of the things where we feel mistreated, where we feel justified in responding back to somebody in a like manner. And that deals with this subject that where Jesus begins with the talk about eye for eye and tooth for tooth. And it's interesting to me when you just hear people out in the world in general talking. It always amazes me what portions of scripture that just the average person can quote. And people that you don't associate religiously with church or anything, this will be one of the things that they know this, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Because it justifies that you hit me, I can hit you right back. And that just suits their design for life, I guess. So Jesus begins there, Matthew chapter 5, and verses 38 through 42. Again, this passage dealing with kind of feeling used and abused, as I titled it. Matthew 5:38. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Well, as we read that, our first response kind of is, well, Jesus tells us we can never respond back. The reality is he's not saying that in denying that we have a right to be able to defend, or that we have some of these things that can't happen. But I think he's dealing with the attitude with which we approach these things. How do we respond when somebody does something that is offensive to us, or that abuses us or takes advantage of us? And as he gives them this lesson, he makes no effort to address the reasons behind those actions. He doesn't talk about why are they suing you. He doesn't talk about why did they slap you. He doesn't talk about why are they compelling you to go a mile. Why are they asking for help from you or asking for a loan. He doesn't address any of that. But, and this is why I gave it that title, Feeling Used and Abused. All of these are situations where if we're that person that he's talking to and we're in that situation, we come out of it feeling like somebody got the better of us. Somebody took advantage of me. They slapped me and I didn't respond back, if I do what Jesus says here. Somebody just, they're constantly wanting to borrow from me, or they're constantly asking me to do stuff, and I feel like I'm going above and beyond that, or it's these moments that seem like inconvenience to us, or where people are trying to take advantage and using us. And I think it's important for us to note that as Jesus says this, he does not negate, again, the right to exercise these options. He doesn't come out and say it's wrong to do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That was the law. I mean, that was a written part of the law of Moses. It's not even a case of their misinterpreting it. Now, they were misapplying it a little bit in the way that they were doing, but Jesus he's not talking about the legality of it. In fact, I think he's more referring back to earlier in the sermon as we went through those Beatitudes. And you remember one of the very last things that he worked us up to and got us to was that we're supposed to be trying to be peacemakers so that we are called the children of God. If our attitude and our first response to these things are, if I get hit, I'm going to hit back, will I ever be a peacemaker? Well, I guess only if I hit hard enough that the guy never gets up and he can't cause any more problems. But otherwise, it keeps going. So Jesus is approaching this and saying, we've got to examine our thoughts and our attitudes and our approach behind some of this. How do we gain control in those situations? He's not trying to establish a new law. He's not trying to give them a new application of the law. Instead, he's just saying somebody in the situation has got to stop and think first. So eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the first part of what he deals with here. Again, under the Mosaical law that those Jesus is speaking to were living under, that was the rule of law. God put it in there as part of trying to set a legal precedent for what the government could impose or enforce. You hear in news about trials today that when they're talking about those trials going on, they'll say, well, the law says that this can carry up to a maximum of this amount of penalty, this many years in jail, or this much fine. That's the maximum that they can impose. Well, that was basically what God was doing here. He was saying, regardless of the circumstance, you cannot take more than the damage that they caused. So if they caused the loss of an eye, you can't blind them and take two eyes. All you can take is one. If they knocked out a tooth, you can't, go take care of all of his dental work for him. He just the one. What they failed to understand in that, what part of what Jesus is trying to bring them to is, while the law said eye for eye, tooth for tooth, again, that was supposed to be the maximum. It left room for there to be grace. It left room for there to be forgiveness. It left room for them to look at and understand the circumstances of why something was happening and say, eye for eye is not really what's needed here. There's something lesser. I said that they hadn't read the law wrong, but they were misapplying it. That, like a lot of people today, they wanted to take it into their own hands. If somebody hit me, I didn't take them to court and prove, hey, they hit me and they knocked out a tooth, and so I'm fixing to knock one of his out. They just went ahead and did it. That wasn't what the law intended, wasn't the background for it, but they utilized it to be able to apply that full measure against somebody in every circumstance. I got even. Didn't want to get ahead because then they could come back at me, but I wanted to get even. And it was a mindset and an attitude that said, if I'm hurt, I've got to strike back right now. And Jesus says, if you're going to learn to be a peacemaker, there are going to be times where you've got to say, okay, I'm not hitting back. Maybe even to the other extreme, as he says, turn the other cheek to them. And that's more of Jesus just saying, there's a lot of room here for response that we can give. Then he starts talking about the sued. If they're sued, if you're sued for something, give them more. I didn't realize this till I was studying through this again. I came across something that was talking about some different aspects of their law. And maybe I had heard this before and had forgotten it. The law said that somebody could sue you and take your inner garment. But the outer garment, the bigger, heavier robe, coat, whatever that you wore over everything, if they took it from you, they couldn't keep it longer than that day. Give it back to you. It was in the law that way because the poor often, that was their blanket. So you could take the inner clothes that was supposed to be as nicer, dress up or whatever, but you couldn't deprive him that means of staying warm at night. So there was a limit to what they could do. And Jesus looks at him and says, if he's going to sue you for the inner coat, give him the outer as well. Show them how much you would like to have peace. Give more of yourself than what is required. Again, as Jesus is going through this, that's opposite of everything that we think is the right way to handle things. It's the opposite of what the world tells us to do. He begins talking about if they compel you to go a mile. Remember, at this time, Israel is living under Roman occupation. Roman law said that a Roman soldier traveling anywhere throughout the empire could require a non-citizen, someone of the conquered nations, to carry their burden for them for up to a mile. He couldn't make them go past a mile. But as he's traveling, hey, you, come carry this bag for me. And they had to carry it a mile. Didn't matter what they were doing, didn't matter how much they wanted to or how busy they were or anything else. If he said carry it, you had to carry it. Chances are when you got a mile down the road, he was going to just pick the next guy and have somebody else pick it up and carry it for a mile. The Jews were so familiar with this happening to them that it was said that from their house, I guess a lot of times they would come up, knock on the door, and get you to come out and carry it for them all times of day or night. That they would measure out a mile from their house in every direction and put a stake down. And so if they were compelled from their house to carry it for a mile, they knew where that mile was to be able to say, there's your bag back. I'm not taking it any further. And now here's Jesus saying that they compel you to go a mile. Take it a second mile. Display something different than that resentful mile that they always see. I heard a preacher years ago sort of tell the story of somebody doing this. And you know most as they carry that grudging mile, they're muttering under their breath about what they do if the law didn't compel them to do and whatever, And he's told the story then of one who took Jesus' advice and carried out this conversation because he was determined, I'm going to respond differently to this. And I don't remember all the details of how he told the story. It's been so long ago. But when he got to the end of it, the guy said, the Roman soldier said, "You're not like any other Jew I've ever met." You know, they all grumbled and complained, and you carried this and you know, even went beyond what you had to do. And the point of his illustration was just how much of a difference can we make in the lives of people when we go above and beyond, and we take this approach that I'm not going to feel like I'm being abused. I'm not going to feel like I'm being taken advantage of. I've taken it out of that realm, and I've taken control of the situation because I'm willingly carrying it that mile. I'm willingly carrying it the second mile. And so I can change how people view me. I can change how those relationships begin to go about. And then the last one that Jesus used in this situation is this loan. And he said, "Give to anyone who asks you. Do not turn away." I remind us again here, Jesus is not talking in absolutes here. He's not saying that these are the things we have to do in every single situation. With the whole thing, he's not saying that there's not a time where it might be appropriate to give the maximum sentence, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. He's not saying that there's not going to be moments where you stand up for yourself in court when you're being sued and hold on to what you got. He's not saying that there's not going to be times where you can't go the second mile because what got interrupted is something that's important and I need to get back to that. With this one, he's not saying that we can't have some discretion about who we loan to or the circumstances under which we loan. He's not saying make bad loans or give it indiscriminately. What he's saying is when approached and there is a need and you have the means, don't begrudge the individual and not loan it to them just because it's inconvenient to you. Why put this combination of things together? And I've kind of alluded to this a little bit already, but it's the taking control of the situation. I'll be careful how I say this. We live in a society today that so many I'm trying to be careful how I say this so I say it right. So many people feel like or end up being a victim. That anything and everything that happens in their life is just one more case that somebody's abusing them, somebody's taking advantage, that nothing goes right in their life. The poor, pitiful me's, the whatever. And are there times and cases where somebody's been victimized? Absolutely. Are there times and cases where somebody's taking advantage of somebody? Absolutely. But how we respond to those things is going to go a long way in determining how the rest of our life is going to be. And we can stay there and be a victim and feel like a victim the rest of our life and lean on that or use it as a crutch or whatever the outcome that comes there is, or we can take control. and say, yeah, somebody may be taking advantage of me, but I'm not going to let that dictate the entire rest of my life. Somebody may have harmed me. They may have knocked out a tooth. They may have, harmed me in a lot of bad ways that happened today. But will I let that be a one-time thing, and I figure out how to take control of my response and move on, or do I allow it to ruin the rest of my life? And I really think Jesus is talking a lot about taking control here. I take control of the outcome of how I'm going to respond, of how much I'm going to allow that to affect my well-being, to affect my life, to affect my role as a peacemaker. And again, Jesus leaves it where we can have those moments where we can stand by the dictates of the law, where we can demand the equal justice. And then there will be those times where we can recognize, the reality of it is there's not going to be any equal justice under the law here. But there will be with God. And so I'm going to move past that. I'm not going to try to settle it up myself between me and the law and this individual. I'm just going to let God handle it. And I'm going to move forward. When we take control, when we give a chosen response, we begin to overcome those feelings of use and abuse. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's a short road or quick thing to get over. But it's the beginning of the process. So that's Jesus dealing with these first things. And we're going to go ahead and talk this morning because about the next section, because it ties together with what Jesus is trying to accomplish here. Because he gives us some further steps which deal with the subject of love. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Okay, well, that sounds like I've got somebody that's harmed me. They're my enemy. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. They tie together. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Wow. That's asking a lot, Jesus. It's one thing to maybe to try to let it go and just ignore it, act like it didn't happen. Now you're saying I've got to find a love for them, some level of a forgiveness for them. I've got to pray for good things for them. Verse 45, do this so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's a big step from feeling abused, feeling used, feeling put out, wanting to take actions against someone, saying a prayer for them. And not the kind of prayers David offered a lot of that we see in Psalm. Lord, when are you going to take care of my enemies? When are you going to uphold this? When are you... prayer is more like Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Father, help them to understand what they've done. Help them to have a change. I've said before, I'm always amazed when I see some of these court cases and see a family member get up at the end when they have their opportunity to talk, and someone's there that has killed or done something very bad to one of their loved ones, and to see them say, I forgive you. I've never been in that situation. I've never had to find out whether I could say that or not. There's a part of me that thinks Daniel's going to struggle a little bit with getting here. And yet, again, Jesus hasn't said that we don't have a right to ask for them to be put on trial or have that dealt with through the system. But he's looking for peacemakers. He's looking for those who are trying to take those which are enemies and make them into friends. And aren't we glad that God did that? While we were still enemies, Christ died for the ungodly. When God had every right to look at us, very much in the same way he looked at them in the days of Noah. When he looked and he searched and all he found was Noah to be righteous. And he said that the minds and the hearts of everybody else are continually on evil. And he sent a flood to wipe them out. So many periods throughout our history where God could look at us and say, I'm sorry I ever made this group of people. And would be justified in his actions to have wiped man out and either started again or said, forget that experiment. But God wanted peace with us. And he said, I love the one that is now my enemy because I want him to be my family. Not just friend. God wants us to be family. And there's a challenge in that for us. But as Jesus points out, what's the difference in us and the world if we can't figure out how to make attempts to change somebody from being an enemy to being a friend? The world loves those that love them. They seek to destroy those who hate them or who they think hates them. As Christians, we're supposed to be different. We're supposed to be more like the God that looked down and said, I love them too much to destroy them without giving them an opportunity. Without giving them the possibility of change. And Jesus brings in this thought of reward. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Well, I get the reward that they continue loving me. I already had that. If I greet only those people that I know, those people that are part of my own group, what reward do I get outside of that? The answer is none. If I take them to court and I get some measure of justice out of the systems here, what reward do I really get out of that? Something that's temporary. But there is a reward beyond what can be taken. God sees our responses, He evaluates them, and He rewards them for what they are, an effort to be more like Him. When we learn to go above and beyond what the world says should be our reaction, only then can we begin to change an enemy to a friend. Only then can we begin to claim the rewards that God is laying up for us in heaven. Only then can we begin to gain that measure of recapturing our life and who we really are supposed to be, who God intended us to be. These can be a difficult portion of Scripture for us, because it goes against the very nature that the world has instilled in us. But it is God's call to renew us to the nature we were intended to have. His nature as we were created in His image. We'll pick up and carry on with our next section next week. If there's something we can do this morning. And again, this is one of those things that it's a challenging passage for us. Maybe we haven't responded the way we needed to in the past. Maybe there's something going on right now that we're not responding the way that we really ought to. Maybe we're still dealing with burdens from some of those past events that we haven't figured out how to get by because we haven't figured out how to take the step that Jesus is talking about. If there's something we can do to assist you in that this morning, let us know how we can help you as we stand together and sing.